In this lecture, we'll create a few more obstacle prefab variants to add some randomness to our bridge. Using these different assets inside of our GDTV Assets Prefabs folder, let's pick out half a dozen or so different obstacles that we can use. A bit of a word of warning, I put in this stool, table, and stump models in because I thought they would actually make good models flying down our scene. Upon further inspection on all three of these models, if you actually go underneath the model, it doesn't look like the normals on the mesh are actually positioned correctly, meaning you actually can't see the very bottom of this table leg here, or the bottom of this stool, or the bottom of this tree stump, sadly. So unless you get creative with how you actually want to set that up in your scene, it might look a little bit goofy in your game view. To fix that, it would actually require opening up a 3D modeling software, something like Blender, and actually going in and fixing and flipping the normals. Outside of that, go ahead and pick 5 or so other obstacles that we can create variants with. I'm probably going to use this barrel, this bench, maybe this cannon, either this bench or this chair, all of good options, maybe this chest, this box. Most of everything else we're going to use in other places. Hold off on using these 2 rocks in our prefabs folder. I've kind of got something special in mind a little bit later on to set this rock up in a slightly unique way, kind of shattering and shaking our screen a little bit later on. For now, let's start with something really simple like this barrel, and then I'll actually let you do the other 3 or 4 on your own. So assets, let's head back into our prefabs folder, right-click my base obstacle prefab, and create a prefab variant. I'm going to call this one my barrel. I'll double click this one, open it up, head back to my GDTV assets, and find my barrel, just drag it underneath my cube. I can delete my cube and delete this mesh collider here. And instead of having this barrel be this sort of square, I think it would make a lot more sense if we just had a capsule collider. So let's add a capsule collider. And it might be a nice little trick if we still have a little bit of an overlapping box. Even though this is kind of the shape of what you would think is just sort of a capsule, I find the extra little geometry from having both the box and the sphere kind of makes it look like it's just jumping through the scene a little bit more natural. So let's just go ahead and quickly edit this capsule here. Slide this guy down and just kind of roughly get it into place. Kind of looking at it from the top, up my radius just a little bit. I don't need to be too precise about it at the moment. And you know what? It really doesn't even need to be perfect. I find I almost have a better result with how they're jumping around my scene if everything isn't quite lined up so perfectly. So let's go ahead and keep that as is for now. On my rigid body, up my mass just a little bit, have a little bit of drag. I can't remember what we had before. I think it was something around 0.2. Have my angular drag. I do want it to roll still kind of like a barrel, so maybe something like 0.4 for now. I think that'll be a reasonable starting place. Let's go create another physics material in our folder. I can actually just duplicate this one, call it barrel, and just change a few properties here. Dynamic friction, let's actually make sure it's moving linearly, a little bit more quick. So 0.2, maybe just a little bit of static friction so it's not rolling down so easily. And up my bounciness since it's a bit of a smaller object and I do kind of want it bouncing throughout the scene, but maybe just to have a slightly different result on how it's bouncing around the scene, just change my bounce combine back to average. Let's just make sure that while we're here, we assign our barrel physics material. So we've got 2 box colliders. Let's just drag in our barrel material here, as well to our second capsule collider, to this material field here as well. Now, if we navigate back to our obstacle spawner, we only have the option to drop in 1 obstacle prefab. Let's open back up our obstacle spawner and change it in a way so that we can actually instantiate a random obstacle from an array of prefabs that we can assign in the inspector. So let's change our obstacle prefab to an array, and let's just rename that to obstacle prefabs to make it plural. Inside of our while loop, let's just randomize what side of object we want to spawn inside of our array, no matter how many objects we decide to put in this array. So let's create a game object. Let's just call this obstacle prefab that we want to spawn, and we'll set this equal to obstacle prefabs, meaning we'll go into this array here, and then we just need to grab a random one from inside of it. So random.range. If you scroll over this, you can actually see it's going to take in either a float or an integer, and then it's actually going to randomize between those 2 values. If you randomize in between a float, it actually will take 2 inclusive values, meaning you can actually get the last value that you put in as a parameter as well. However, you'll notice if you actually put in an integer, for example, say something like 0, ranging from obstacle prefabs dot length, meaning it will return the count from this array. Now, if you were to actually hover over it, you're actually going to see that it's going to return an inclusive range from the first parameter, aka 0, and return all the way up to the exclusive amount for the last range that you put in. That means that obstacle prefabs, if we have 2 obstacles, is going to return 2, but this random integer is actually going to return 0 or 1, meaning that because obstacle prefabs is a 0-based index array, we'll always be able to get the 2 objects inside of that array. A little bit confusing until you get used to working with 0-based indexes. Now that we actually have that reference to a new obstacle prefab created, we just want to make sure we're passing that obstacle prefab into our instantiate method. To make sure our hierarchy isn't getting too messy, let's child this new obstacle prefab to a transform game parent in our hierarchy. So serialized field, we'll create a transform once we get back to Unity that we can just call obstacle parent. And as you recall, you can actually just take this obstacle parent, pass it in as an optional overload inside of our instantiate method as the very last argument that we can put inside, and it will automatically child each individual new obstacle prefab to this obstacle parent. Nice, let's head back into Unity and make sure that's rigged up correctly. Now inside of our obstacle spawner component, we actually see that we have this array where we can actually just drop a couple different objects in. So I'm just going to actually lock this in the inspector so it doesn't toggle away, head into my prefabs folder, and drop in my cart and my barrel. Let's go ahead and unlock that, give it a play, and just make sure everything is rigged up correctly. Did I drop in my parent? I don't think so. Getting ahead of myself. Let's also drop in my obstacle parent into my inspector. Let's hit play one more time and see if that works. We should just be randomizing in between the cart, and then hopefully our barrel, as soon as it actually takes the time to instantiate, actually, cool. It does actually look pretty good bouncing throughout our scene. I think I do like that effect. If you were to just have the capsule collider on the barrel, you might have some slightly unintended effects on how it was very quickly rolling down the bridge. You may be able to achieve something I wasn't quite able to get with just the capsule collider. I think the last thing I'd like to do before I make a few different prefab variants is just get our obstacles spawning at just a slightly different point across our bridge from left to right. So I think that's our x-axis. Let's go do that back in our obstacle spawner as well. So let's create a serialized field. We'll create a float, and we'll just call this spawn width. And I'm actually going to initialize this to something smaller than you might think. Let's say something like 4 to start, because we're actually going to be using the negative and the positive value, meaning that we'll actually have about a width of 8 that we can spawn in between. Down here in our while loop, when we're actually also choosing what obstacle prefab to drop in, let's also create a new vector 3 that we can call spawn position. So vector 3, I'll call this spawn position. And for this, we can actually use random.range again. So go ahead, mini challenge if you'd like, go ahead and pause the video and see if you can actually generate a random range in between 2 different x values that we can spawn in our obstacle prefab. Okay, let's go ahead and try that on our own. So new vector 3, random.range, and then passing through different arguments. I'm just going to use negative spawn width to positive spawn width. This float value that will be randomly created is going to only be our x value. So we still want to use the transform.position.y and the transform.position.z value for this game object on which this class is attached to. So that way it's actually going to matter where we actually position our obstacle spawner. Nice, I think you can all see that on one line. Once we have our vector 3 spawn position created, instead of instantiating our obstacle prefab at transform.position, let's just replace this argument here with spawn position. Nice, let's go hop back into Unity and see what that looks like. Give it a play and give it a whirl. Let's keep our eyes way down here just to make sure they're randomly being instantiated across our bridge. Yeah, seems to be working as intended with objects being both spawned on the left and the right. With that set up, I'd like to introduce you to this lecture's challenge. Create 4 to 6 different obstacle variants that link back to our base obstacle prefab, just adding a little bit of variety into our scene before we move on. Adjust the rigid body settings as needed, but they may not all need their own unique physics material. Spend as much or as little time on this as you'd like. I'm not going to be too privy or spend too much time on it being super specific and drilling in each individual obstacle, but I'd like to have some variety in my scene before I move on. Now, I'm not going to set up all of these different obstacle variants with you on screen. I think the motions are just a little bit too tedious. So for the sake of time, go ahead and set up these prefab variants on your own. Pause the video. When you get back, we'll both have half a dozen or so different obstacle variants that we can use. All right, welcome back. I think I have my prefabs in a pretty good spot. Let's hop into my assets prefabs folder. I've got, I believe, 5 different obstacle prefabs. I've gone ahead and also added a cannon, a barrel, and I believe a bench and a box. I feel like I do have a lot of success combining this box and a capsule collider just to kind of get things always rolling but moving in an erratic way. I did feel kind of clever about how I did my cannon, however. I did take the cannon model, just kind of rotate it slightly so it wasn't exactly on the 0 value on my x-axis. And then I just positioned my box and my capsule collider appropriately just to kind of match up with the legs of the cannon. I did not, however, actually use a new physics material for each individual obstacle. You could probably just get away with using some sort of default obstacle physics material for most of your obstacles. That is, unless you feel like you either needed it or you just wanted it to behave a little bit differently in your scene. On my obstacle spawner, I've positioned my Y value back to 5 just to make sure my obstacles are bouncing right out of the gate to once again kind of get some of that erratic movement. Let's go ahead, blow up my game view and see how I'm looking. I should have 5 different obstacles randomly spawning between the different array. I was having a little bit of an issue with the bench. I wouldn't be too surprised if that actually gets stuck along the way. Looks like it's working pretty good for now. That's just a long rectangle box collider without that additional capsule collider, just to kind of give me a little bit of a variety. Alrighty, you know what? I think I'm set to move on. When you have at least a few different prefab variants in your game for some variety, you'll be ready to move on as well. I'll see you in the next one.